Hello, my name is Dr. Stephen D. Kniffely Jr. I'm here to talk with you all a little bit about race-based trauma in education. So our objectives for today are following four areas. We're going to define race-related stress. We're going to explore how the experience of racial trauma can impact us from a psychological, physical, and relational standpoint. We'll also discuss the systemic impact of racial trauma in the education setting, as well as highlight policies and interventions that we can use as educators, administrators, and staff when it comes to addressing racial trauma in the education setting. So just a little bit about myself. I'm an assistant professor at Spalding University, as well as the associate director for our Center for Behavioral Health. I have the very proud honor of being the coordinator for Kentucky's only racial trauma clinic, the Collective Care Center, where we provide free and accessible service to those folks that need it, that have experienced race-based stress and trauma. From an educational standpoint, I have a doctorate in clinical psychology, as well as a master's degree in clinical psychology. I also have a master's in public administration from Wright State University, as well as a bachelor's in psychology from the University of Louisville. I'm a licensed psychologist and I'm board certified in clinical psychology, where I specialize in working with Black males. In my private practice, I only see Black males between the ages of about 5 to 18. Additionally, my research and clinical interests include all things Black folks related, specifically looking at Black male psychology, as well as multicultural psychology, and then the treatment of racial trauma. I always like to pay homage to my ancestors, because without them, I would not be here. So you can see to the picture to my right there is a picture of myself with my grandfather, who was a very important individual to me and certainly has helped me to become the man that I am today. So, I'm just a lowly assistant professor, so I have to hustle these books a little bit because I have these student loans. So I have 4 books total, with the 5th book on the way. But the 2 most helpful books for us to think about in this space are my 2 most recent ones, Out of Chaos, Knowledge of Self, Black Masculinity, Psychopathology, and Treatment, which helps us to explore how do we provide quality mental health treatment to Black males, and offers a model of what the treatment of Black male psychology can look like. Additionally, I have a text that just came out last year, Black Males in the Criminal Justice System, which um, allows us to take a look from arrest to reentry, the experience that Black males have when it comes to their involvement in the criminal justice system. I've been very fortunate to do a TED Talk where myself and a colleague, Dr. Julie Williams, talk about how do you have difficult dialogues with folks that are different from yourself. Additionally, I was recently acknowledged as one of Louisville's top 40 under 40 as part of the class of 2020. I also host a blog called The Afrocentric Psychologist, where we talk about all things Black folks related, with a specific focus on Black mental health, Black social justice issues, and Black folks in the criminal justice system. I've been very fortunate to be able to offer expertise in a variety of media platforms. One of the things I always notice is that I'm always wearing the same suit. So really got to try to step on my dress game here, especially if I'm going to be doing much more of that here in the near future. So I always like to start these conversations by talking about, well, what has inspired me to do this work when it comes to providing healing for racial trauma, and then supporting those folks who are seeking to intervene when youth and adults and other Black folks experience issues related to race-based stress. So I've had the very great fortune to travel all over the world, and 2 of my favorite places have been South Africa and Senegal. And during those experiences, I was able to pick up a couple of ways of thinking about the world that I've internalized into my own work when it comes to the treatment of racial trauma. The first word comes from South Africa. It is Ubuntu. And then Ubuntu is a South African philosophy that really highlights this ideal that we are all interconnected to one another, that there's this energy, this spiritual presence that binds us all together. And if we think about folks that have experienced race-based stress, especially our youth, they might feel like they are alone or that they have no one they can reach out to support them that will validate their experience when it comes to racism and discrimination. And so part of our work when it comes to the school setting is to help those folks to realize that they are indeed not alone and that they have folks that are connected to them. Additionally, when I was in South Africa, there was this term called Sawubona, and Sawubona is a Zulu greeting. It essentially means "I see you." And for many of our youth, they are fighting every day in order to be seen for their authentic selves and for their experience to be affirmed and validated. And when it comes to supporting our youth that have experienced race-based stress in the school setting, it's really important to make sure that we are working with them to be seen and to help them to see others for how they wish to be seen as well. Additionally, there's this term called Sankofa, and Sankofa essentially means this idea of looking back, looking at our history. And if we think about some of the challenges that Black individuals are experiencing, a lot of it has to do with just having a general unawareness of the resiliency and the affirmation connected to our history. Our ancestors were able to make it past the Middle Passage. They were able to make it through slavery. They were able to make it through black codes and convict leasing and Jim Crow and fight for all of our rights as part of the civil rights movement. And there's a strong history connected to that. But also there's a history that is outside of all of those pieces as well, because our history isn't just connected to suffering, it's also connected to success as well. Lastly, here, there's this term that says if you conquer the enemy within, the enemy without can do you no harm. And for many of our youth, if we think about studies connected to the Brown versus Board of Education, which found that Black youth, based on being in segregated schools, had internalized a sense of self-hate when it came to their racial background, as they were kind of discussing during the 1940s. And if we look in today's time, youth still in today's time are still struggling with this idea of internalized racism. And so part of our work when it comes to supporting those folks, our youth that have experienced race-based stress, is to support them as they seek to fight those enemies within. Because if we can help them to conquer that internalized racism, if we can help them to conquer those negative messages that they are receiving about their racial background, then indeed all of the bad things that are happening in our world right now will do them no harm. So you might be wondering, well, why even have this conversation about racial trauma? I mean, surely there are other types of trauma that are out there. There's PTSD, and doesn't that capture all the trauma that our youth are experiencing? So I want to highlight a couple of statistics to help guide our conversation. The first one is that 96% of African Americans across the US are now reporting experiencing at least one episode of discrimination during their lifetimes, and many are reporting this on a daily basis. Additionally, the rate of depression for Black males has quadrupled in the last 2 decades, contributing to suicide now being the third leading cause of death, not just for Black males ages 15 to 24, but now Black males across the lifespan, all the way from 10 all the way and up. Additionally, one might wonder, well, our educational status or one's socioeconomic status can provide a buffer against the experience of race-based stress and trauma and the negative impact that it can have. But there's been some research that has indicated that higher earning Black women have the same risk for low birth weight babies as low earning white women, which highlights this idea that one's socioeconomic status, one's educational status is not providing the buffer one would expect when it comes to the experience of racism and discrimination. A good example of that are the challenges and complications that someone like Serena Williams experienced as part of her childbirth. And this is someone that has significant access to resources and essentially still have the same rate or the same vulnerability to the experience of having a low birth weight baby. Additionally, the Center for Hate for the study of hate and extremism found that hate crimes are at their highest level in a decade, with African Americans being the most targeted group, suggesting that when it comes to racial crimes, when it comes to hate crimes, Black individuals are the most hated group out of all of our racial demographics. And so, if you take all of these statistics together, subjectively, Black individuals are reporting almost daily experiences of racism, discrimination that is then being supported objectively by the number of hate crimes experienced by those individuals, which is then impacting our mental health when it comes to depression, as well as instances of suicide and suicide ideation. And what we would expect to be a buffer when it comes to one's educational background and one's socioeconomic status, not providing the protection one might expect. And so, because of that, it is important to talk about this idea of racial trauma because it is certainly impacting us psychologically, physically, and as well as relationally in a different way than perhaps other types of trauma would. And so this just kind of highlights a little bit more about that idea of how we're being impacted by trauma and the ways in which it can't be quantified necessarily by just the experience of physical or emotional types of trauma. And so here we see that some evidence points to higher rates of lifetime prevalence of PTSD among African Americans compared to other racial groups. We know that although African Americans report lower rates of exposure to traumatic events, the risk of developing PTSD afterwards is higher, even when adjusted for factors such as gender, age, and the type of exposure that was incurred. The research has suggested then that repeated discriminatory experiences and racial stigmatization may increase this unique form of PTSD from African Americans, specifically talking about this ideal of racial trauma. And so it's important for us to talk about microaggressions because the research is suggesting that that is the mechanism that is contributing to the negative impact that racial trauma and race-based stress are having for Black individuals, and specifically here, our Black youth. And so microaggressions are those commonplace verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities that could be intentional or not, that are really designed to communicate a hostile or negative racial slights that insult people of color. Now, there are three different types of microaggressions. There are micro insults, micro assaults, and micro invalidations. Micro insults are communications that are designed to convey rudeness and insensitivity as a way to demean one's racial heritage. Micro assaults are those more kind of explicit ways of engaging in verbal or nonverbal attacks that are meant to harm individuals. And so this is utilizing words such as thug to describe Black males. Additionally, the last one here, micro invalidations, are those communications that are used to exclude, negate, or nullify the thoughts, feelings, or experiences of persons of color. And so our youth are referring to micro invalidation specifically here as gaslighting. And these are designed to deny, demean, and denigrate someone based on the color of their skin and their racial or ethnic background. And so some examples of micro insults are saying things like you're a credit to your race, or why are your people so loud? And so these are indications that you are being singled out because the expectation is that other folks that look like you uh, would not be credits to their races. Additionally, micro invalidations are saying things like, I don't see color. If you don't like it here, you can go back to your country. We're all a melting pot. We're all Americans. And if everyone just works hard enough, they can succeed. And what these do is these deny the lived experiences of Black individuals and other persons of color by suggesting that there is no existence of factors such as systemic racism that would impact how one might look at them or their access to opportunities and chances for success. And so the challenge with microaggressions is that the first time one experiences a microaggression, they're able to utilize their adaptive coping strategies. So they're able to combat that experience verbally by challenging the person and their beliefs. They're able to state an alternative when it comes to highlighting their truths and their lived experiences, or they're able to find out spaces of affirmation and support and validation when they encounter microaggressive behaviors and actions. However, as we noted before, Black individuals are reporting almost daily experiences of discrimination, which means that it's not the first time that they experience a microaggression, it's the 10th time, and the 100th time, and the 1,000th time, and the 10,000th time that leads to this exhaustion of one's adaptive coping strategies. And as we are become exhausted in terms of how we are trying to cope with these microaggressions, we then start to experience this idea of race-related stress because our inability to cope leads us to be more stressed out. And this is specifically due to the discrimination that we are experiencing based on our racial background. And so one might wonder, well, how is race-related stress different from other types of stress? And there are three things for us to note here. First is the chronicity of race-related stress. As we had noted before, Black individuals report a daily or almost a daily experience of racism and discrimination, which means that from the time one is born until the time one dies, as a Black individual, you can almost guarantee that you will experience some form of microaggression, either personally or through witnessing the microaggressions that someone else that looks like you has experienced. Additionally, there's important for us to recognize the socio-historical emphasis that has led folks to intentionally think about Black individuals based on these negative messages that deny, demean, or denigrate our experience and highlight us as dumb, deviant, and dangerous individuals. And to note that these are intentional efforts via popular culture and our media to communicate these messages and that have been communicated over a long period of time. Lastly, here is the ambiguous nature of race-related stress. And the ambiguity stems from that experience of microaggressions because we can't necessarily touch the microaggression oftentimes. And then because microaggressions are more covert in nature, the person that contributed the microaggression or caused the microaggression is able to deny it. So if someone comes up to me and says, you know, did you catch that basketball game yesterday? Or wow, you were really articulate. You know, if I was to ask them what they meant by those comments, they can easily say, well, I didn't mean anything racially connected to that. But there's a strong likelihood that they might not say those similar things to someone that does not look like me. But I'm left to hold and to wonder what that person was referring to. And because I'm left to wonder, and because I can contribute to me questioning my lived experience and my thoughts about racism and discrimination, that highlights the ambiguous nature that microaggressions can have that contributes to this idea of race-related stress. And so what we have here is a cycle where one experiences microaggressions. So the first one isn't a big deal, but the 10th one and the 10,000th one, et cetera, causes this challenge to our adaptive coping strategies, which means that we are more likely to utilize maladaptive coping strategies due to being stressed out based on one's racial background, which then leaves us more vulnerable to this experience of racial trauma as we bear witness to various indignities that Black individuals are witnessing or experiencing in the media and in our personal lives, and also, of course, here in the school setting. And this cycle kind of continues where one experiences microaggressions, one then experiences that race-related stress of being stressed out due to their racial background, which then leaves them more vulnerable to racial trauma, and then lessens their ability to cope with adaptively those experiences of microaggressions. So I just want to talk here a little bit about the impact of racial trauma, specifically thinking about the psychological impact as well as the biological impact. So when it comes to the psychological impact, many folks might be aware of these symptoms due to their connection to the experience of PTSD. And so one might experience flashbacks and nightmares, intrusive thoughts, that inability to concentrate, and hyperactivity. And I always like to stop here and highlight that inability to concentrate and hyperactivity So, as a child psychologist, I often receive referrals for testing, specifically for either behavioral challenges or to rule out ADHD. And what we know in the literature is that PTSD and racial trauma, in a lot of ways, can mirror ADHD and behavioral related symptoms. And so, one of the things I'm always trying to be mindful of when I receive these referrals is to first rule out, has this youth experienced any form of racial trauma or race based stress that might be impacting or influencing their ability to concentrate, any sort of attention issues, or any sort of negative behavior that they're exhibiting in the classroom setting. Additionally, we know that folks can be impacted in regards to having a restrictive emotional expression, and the term for that is also alexithymia. And so what that means is that when one experiences trauma, they actually lose their ability to communicate their emotional experience to others. If we think about some of the challenges that we might see with our youth when it comes to behavioral challenges or anger issues or challenges in regards to their social skills, if one has experienced racial trauma and one has lost that ability to communicate their emotional experience, then they are more likely to engage in these behaviors because they have found that they have no other way to tell folks that they are struggling when it comes to race-based stress and trauma. So this slide highlights the biological impact that racial trauma can have on Black individuals. Um, when one experiences stress, they then experience a stress response because stress indicates that we might be in some form of danger. And so our bodies are then equipping us to fight, flight, or freeze in the situation. And so the hormone that is involved in that process is called cortisol. And cortisol in the appropriate doses allows us to protect ourselves and to defend ourselves from challenging situations. However, when there's too much cortisol in the body, that can lead to some significant physiological outcomes that are negative in nature. If we think about the experience that Black individuals are having, they're constantly stressed out based on their racial background. Um, because they're constantly being exposed to racism and discrimination, which means that they have higher levels of cortisol in their bodies than compared to other races of people. And this contributes to a decreased immune system, which means that Black individuals, is thinking about our youth here, are more vulnerable to chronic illness. It can contribute to depression. And remember, we had talked about how the rates of depression have quadrupled for Black males, and now suicide is the third leading cause of death across the lifespan for Black males. It can contribute to hypertension. And we know that Black males, especially adult Black males in their 50s, are more vulnerable to the experience of heart attack and heart disease. It can contribute to chronic fatigue. It can contribute to sleep deprivation. And so challenges related to insomnia. It could also contribute to migraines as well as hostility. And so there have been a number of studies that have been done to talk about this biological impact when it comes to how it's passed down through the generations, as well as how it influences the experience of challenges such as cancer. So there was a study that was done that looked at the biological transmission of a racial trauma response, specifically related to cortisol from mother to child. And what the research found is that when a mother reported having higher experiences related to racial trauma, which then elevated her levels of cortisol, the baby that she gave birth to also had those same levels of cortisol in their bodies as well, which highlighted the fact that these babies were then coming out into the world essentially already stressed out, even though they hadn't experienced any sort of racism or discrimination yet. They were already prepared for those challenges to happen. Additionally, a study in the early 2000s found that when women immigrated from Africa to here, um, when they had a child in Africa, that child was typically of a normal birth weight. However, when that child grew up, and if it was a daughter and then gave birth to her child, and then subsequently that daughter gave birth to her child, what they found is that the babies became smaller. So they were being born earlier, and they were also exhibiting lower birth weights. And so the researchers were able to highlight that this happened because of the racial trauma that that the subsequent women in these families were experiencing, that was contributing to them giving birth to lower birth weight babies. Additionally, there's a form of cancer when it comes to breast cancer that Black women are most vulnerable to. And what the research has shown is that there's a connection potentially between racial trauma and this very aggressive form of breast cancer. What they found is that uh, women who had experienced significant racial trauma and reported experiencing racial trauma actually were more likely to experience this more aggressive form of breast cancer. And so, if we take all these research pieces together, what they highlight is that due to the experiences of racial trauma, Black individuals are more vulnerable to the experiences of more aggressive forms of cancer, potentially, and then also giving birth to low birth weight babies. And they're more vulnerable to the passing on through the generations of these racial trauma responses due to the excess of cortisol that is passed from mother to child. And so I have this quote here that says, when we think about this idea of racial trauma in education, because remember, we just talked about how folks have been impacted when it comes to the psychological impact of racial trauma. We've also talked about the biological impact of racial trauma. We've talked about how microaggressions serve as the mechanism that facilitates this impact between psychological and physical symptoms and the experience of race-based stress and trauma. And so now we turn our focus here to racial trauma in education specifically. And so Carter G. Woodson, who is the founder of Negro Week, Dr. Woodson, the founder of Negro Week, which then became Black History Month, has this quote here that says, "The same educational process which inspires and stimulates the oppressor with the thought he is everything and has accomplished everything worthwhile, depresses and crushes at the same time the spark of genius in the Negro while making him feel that his race does not amount to much and never will measure up to the standards of other people." And what Dr. Woodson is referring to here is this ideal that our educational systems, based on the perpetuation of systemic racism within the educational setting, can actually contribute to this internalization of racism that Black individuals, Black youth are experiencing, which then leads to them being apathetic about education and then also experiencing low self-esteem because they do not see themselves reflected in the text that they are being taught. They do not see themselves being reflected in the schools in terms of the administration staff and teachers that are supporting them from an educational standpoint. And so there are two ways in which racism is perpetuated in the school setting. The first one here is the predominantly white teaching force and the teachers, the educational faculty that teach the teachers, and then also just the access to school resources. And so what the researchers noticed is that about 88% of the 35,000 full-time faculty within University of Education departments are white, which means that it's likely that new teachers will develop a pedagogy that primarily serves a dominant culture. Additionally, 90% of all public school teachers are white, and then more than 40% of all public schools do not even employ one teacher of color. And what this highlights is that a predominantly white teaching force can have adverse effects on a student's self-perception, especially if those teachers have a minimal cultural understanding. Additionally, when it comes to access to resources, one of the things to note here is that many of our public schools do not have the same type of resources due to challenges in funding or challenges related to getting the support that they need to be able to adequately support the students that are in those school settings. And so there's a lack of equity when it comes across different school districts and different school settings that can also perpetuate this type of systemic racism. And so these are two different ways that racism can exist in the school setting through white faculty in education departments instructing mostly white teachers who are then mostly teaching Black and brown students utilizing a curriculum that was written for and written by and mostly written about white individuals and white history. And so it's important to note here that as Carter G. Woodson was referring to is this idea of internalized racism. So if I am a student that goes to a poorly resourced school that is being taught by mostly white teachers, that is connected to folks who have then themselves been taught by mostly white faculty, utilizing texts that are for and about white individuals, I'm more likely to internalize these negative stereotypes that are connected to my racial background, especially if my history is only reduced to that of the civil rights movement and to slavery, not recognizing the contributions that Black individuals have made, not only in this country, but throughout the world as well. And so what the internal racism can do is it can result in students of color unconsciously accepting those substandard conditions in education. And so being in places where they don't see themselves or being in schools where they are under-resourced, just accepting that and accepting their plight and their condition within those school settings instead of demanding more from their teachers, from their administrators and staff, the school districts itself. And so students then internalize the racism connected to teachers, the curriculum, and resources, which can contribute to the disengagement and alienation that we have seen for many of our students within the public school setting. And so I highlight the 1945 Clark and Clark Dawes study as a way to connect us back again to this idea of internalized racism, because that study was fundamental and foundational to winning the Brown versus Board of Education lawsuit, primarily due to the fact that they were able to highlight um, that these students were experiencing internalized racism, which was then having a negative psychological impact, as well as leading to that disengagement and alienation within the school setting. So I just want to talk here. We just finished highlighting the ways in which racism might show up, specifically in regards to a predominantly white teaching force, as well as access to school resources. But it's also important for us to think about, well, how do microaggressions, how might those show up in the school setting? So the researchers highlighted that there are three levels in which one might experience microaggressions within the school setting. So at the systems level, at the teacher level, and then also at the student level. When it comes to systems level, microaggressions are typically experienced in three areas: disciplinary policies, academic tracking, and curriculum. And what the research has shown is that many schools have adopted a zero tolerance policy when it comes to discipline, which then has increased dropout numbers, school suspensions, and expulsions among students of color. When it comes to academic tracking policies, this system of segregation between advantaged and lesser advantaged students propels psychological factors that include a reevaluation of one's self-concept, self-efficacy, and overall academic motivation. So if I am constantly being placed in lower track classes, um, and never encouraged to live up to my full potential, and that would certainly impact how I think about myself, how I think about others that look like me, as well as my desire to engage in the academic setting. Additionally, there's been some research to highlight the relationship between academic tracking and school dropout populations. And what these findings revealed is that students who were enrolled in lower academic classes were 60% more likely to drop out of school, and were students who were comprised lower tracks were mostly Latino and received special education accommodations as well as came from a lower SAS background. Additionally, this academic tracking was heavily centered around racial and social lines, with students being most underrepresented when it came to higher track courses, especially if they were minorities or those students that would come from lower SES backgrounds. Additionally, when it comes to curriculum, this curriculum can enforce a hierarchical status quo of white supremacy and can render the race of non-white individuals inferior. And so then folks are bombarded by those messages about via the curriculum about the superiority of whites and the inferiority of non-whites, which can indoctrinate students about their placement in the racial hierarchy in relation to their racial background. When it comes to teacher level microaggressions, uh, teacher, teacher perceptions, having a deficit versus asset based perspective, and a lack of culturally relevant practices are all ways in which teachers themselves can engage in those microaggressions. And so there's been a lot of research to show that what a teacher believes about a student can ultimately impact what the student believes about themselves. Additionally, if we constantly focus on the deficits or the challenges that the kid or the youth is having, as opposed to the ways in which we can utilize their cultural background as an asset, that can also lead to challenges for students as well. And then if teachers are not finding ways to engage in more culturally relevant practices that will motivate the student and that will make the information more relevant based on their lived experience, then that is another way that teachers can perpetuate microaggressions as well. And then lastly, microaggressions can occur at the student level when it comes to impacting their mental health and well-being, as well as their thinking about their intelligence and their perceived deviance, as well as how they think about their self-concept, and then their how affirmed they feel about their racial background. And so when it comes to addressing racial trauma in the education setting, there are four areas for us to consider. The first one is cultural humility and finding ways to move away just from a culturally competent way of thinking about the world and instead encouraging teachers, administrators, and staff to engage in a posture of openness and curiosity to the lived experience of their students, rather than seeking to only engage with their students based on a box of information that is not always applicable to every student of color. Additionally, engaging in race-based stress and trauma training to create more racially trauma-informed school settings and classrooms. Furthermore, here is engaging in those microinterventions for microaggressions, knowing that microaggressions are the mechanism that contributes to the experience of race-based stress and trauma and subsequent psychological and physical symptoms. And then lastly, engaging in school-based diversity assessment to address those potential systems level microaggressions that the student of color might experience as part of their day-to-day experience, day-to-day learning experience. So when it comes to microinterventions for microaggressions, there are four areas for us to think about: making the invisible visible, disarming the microaggression, educating the offender, and then seeking external support. So when it comes to making the invisible visible, this offers a corrective experience for the victim of the microaggression and then helps to make plain the meaning under the words that were offered by the individual that committed the microaggression. As we had noted before, one of the challenges when it comes to microaggressions is their ambiguous nature, right? So I as the person impacted by microaggression, am often the one that has to hold and think about and process the microaggression because the other person is able to say it or do it and then move on with their experience. So there are a number of interventions that you can use to make the invisible visible. You can undermine the meta communication. You can make the meta communication more explicit. You can challenge the stereotype, and you can also ask for clarification. So undermining the meta communication allows the individual to verbally describe what is happening in a non-threatening manner. Additionally, making the meta communication explicit allows the individual to let the perpetrator know directly that what they have said or did is offensive in nature. Lastly, here, asking for clarification and or challenging the stereotype allows the individual to challenge the perpetrator to really understand the impact of what they said, recognizing that it's not always the intent that matters. It's more the impact that it has for the individual that experienced the microaggression. Additionally, we can disarm the microaggression. And what this does is this provides a more active strategy for addressing perpetrators of microaggressions by either stopping or deflecting the words or behaviors through disagreement, challenging, or confrontation. And there are four ways in which that can be accomplished. First, we can express disagreement, we can state values and set limits, we can describe what we are experiencing out loud, and we can also use our nonverbal communication. So expressing disagreement can stop or deflect the microaggression, as well as give back a sense of control to the individual. And this can just be as simple as shaking one's head or actually utilizing words out loud that indicate that you disagree with the joke that was made, with the comment that was indicated, or with the behavior that was done by the individuals that contributed or committed the microaggression. Additionally, stating values and setting limits, describing the experience out loud, and utilizing one's nonverbal communication can allow the individual to state their disapproval while communicating values and setting limits. So this allows for the person to say, you know, I disagree with that joke, and I will really appreciate it if you would not say those type of jokes in my presence again. Right. So what you've indicated in that situation is that you stated your value, you don't like the type of joke that was committed, and then you set your limit by telling that person that you do not want them to say those type of jokes in your presence anymore. Additionally, we can educate the offender, and educating the offender provides the opportunity for the individual to engage in a dialogue with the perpetrator about why what they did or said was offensive in nature. There are four interventions that you can utilize underneath this idea of educating the offender. You can point out commonalities. You can differentiate you can highlight the difference between impact and intent. You can point out how the perpetrators will benefit from engaging in less microaggressions. And also you can promote this sense of empathy. And so pointing out commonalities and benefits, as well as promoting empathy, can encourage the perpetrator to explore how their belief systems and their values, as well as learning information about culturally different individuals, can be an important part of their lived experience. Additionally, differentiating between impact versus intent can encourage folks to not utilize the idea of, well, I didn't mean that, or that's not how I meant it, or folks are being too sensitive to highlight that it is not always why we said something. It's more important to think about that what we said has had an impact negatively for the individual and to be able to own whatever that negative impact was. And then lastly, when it comes to seeking external support, sometimes when we have tried to disarm the microaggression, we've tried to educate the offender, we've also sought to make the invisible visible, those strategies just do not work. And so we have to help support our youth as well as ourselves in finding affirming spaces. And there are three different ways that we can engage in seeking that external support. We can seek it through our spiritual, religious, or communal organizations. We can attend support groups, or we can find spaces that foster a sense of community belonging for us. Additionally, in addition to microinterventions for microaggressions, we could also engage in a more system-wide school-based diversity assessment, utilizing different tools to help us to assess our inclusivity, our commitment to diversity, all things that will influence the type of microaggressions that we might experience at the system, teacher, or student level. And so just want to highlight a couple of assessment tools that can be utilized in the school setting. The first one here is a school-wide cultural competency observation scale or measure. And what this tool does is it allows for school leadership to conduct their own cultural competency or cultural assessment audits. And what this looks at are the cultural competency of schools across a couple of domains, including school vision and mission, curriculum, student interaction, and leadership. The next two tools here are more focused on teachers and their perceptions and attitudes towards culturally different individuals. The first one here is a teacher multicultural attitude survey. And what this looks at is a teacher's multicultural awareness and sensitivity. And this explores their attitudes related to socioeconomic status, culture, race, exceptionality, and gender. Additionally, the attitudes towards teaching all student skills specifically look at teachers' attitudes towards students with disabilities. When it comes to policy development, as a way for us to think about how we can facilitate a reduction in microaggressions at the systems level, it's important for us to look at racially trauma, the creation of racially trauma-informed school setting, as well as the disciplinary proceedings or procedures that we're utilizing. And so, when it comes to a racially trauma-informed school setting, it's important for us to think about how we can switch our language from "what is wrong with you" to "what has happened to you." And so a model that I want to introduce here comes from some colleagues out of California. And essentially, what they looked at are ways that we can develop a more racially trauma informed school setting. And so there are four goals that occur under the HEART model. The first one is to increase student wellness, engagement, and success in school. The next is to build staff and school system capacities to support trauma impacted students by increasing knowledge and practice of trauma informed classroom and school wide strategies. The next one is to promote staff wellness to avoid burnout and secondary trauma by witnessing the racial trauma or the race based stress of their students. The last piece here is integrating a cultural and equity lens when it comes to understanding the ways in which trauma shows up for folks, specifically in the areas of disciplinary actions such as suspensions or expulsions. There are six core guiding principles when it comes to the heart model. The first is to understand trauma and stress. Second is to establish safety and predictability. The third here is to foster compassionate and dependable relationships. The fourth here is to promote resiliency and social emotional learning. The next one is to practice cultural humility and responsiveness. And the last one is to facilitate empowerment and collaboration across students, staff, teachers, and administrators. And so our colleagues out of California, they highlighted a tiered process when it comes to creating a more trauma-informed school setting. So at the third level, the tertiary interventions, they occur at students, adults, being staff and caregivers, and systems level, and that can look like school-based, trauma-specific, individual, group, and family therapy services, as well as consultation around IEP assessment plans. That for adults, that can look like brief crisis support for those folks that have been impacted by witnessing the trauma that their students have experienced, as well as providing support for parents and caregivers as they engage their children in different types of therapy. And also at the systems level, that can look like consultation at the central district level when it comes to improving district-wide education-related mental health services. At the tier two level, or the secondary intervention, this could look like psychoeducational skills for at-risk students, and specifically when it comes to racial trauma, providing those microinterventions for microaggressions and providing the information for students to learn more about the ways in which they could be or have been impacted by race-based stress and trauma. The same goes for adults, being staff and caregivers here in terms of providing those wellness groups for witnessing the secondary or experiencing secondary trauma by witnessing the racial trauma and the race-based stress that their students are experiencing. And then lastly here, when it comes to the systems level, providing consultation to help revise disciplinary processes to take a more racially trauma or trauma-informed lens when it comes to offering alternatives to suspensions. And then the last level, or the tier 1 level, is regarding classroom training for students on coping with stress, and specifically here, coping with race-based stress, providing training and consultation for all school staff when it comes to the experience of racial trauma, and providing education for them around those experiences. And then the same can be done for parents as well. And then from a system standpoint, it's just making sure that we're including a racially trauma or trauma informed lens when it comes to the implementation of school-wide supports for various students of color. And so feel free to contact me at Stephen Kniffely at sniffley01 at spalding.edu if you have any questions. Or you can check out my website at drstephenkniffleyjr.com, or feel free to follow me at Dr. Stephen Kniffley Jr. as well. It's certainly been a pleasure and honor to share with you information regarding ways that race-based stress and trauma have impacted our students of color from a psychological standpoint and a biological standpoint, as well as the ways in which microaggressions that occur at the systems level, at the teacher level, and then at the student level can perpetuate those experiences of race-based stress and trauma within the school setting. And also thinking about the 4 areas where we can intervene when it comes to incorporating culturally humble principles in our teaching and administration, when it comes to educating ourselves about race-based stress and trauma, when it comes to incorporating those microinterventions for microaggressions into our engagement and developing our relationships with students, as well as engaging in a school-wide diversity and cultural assessment to identify those areas where our school districts and our schools might be more vulnerable to the perpetuation of microaggressions at that system, teacher, and student level, and identifying appropriate interventions, such as models like the HEART model, to support our students of color. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing from you if you have any questions.